Thank you very much for having me. I think that involving the private sector in these kind of conversations is a very good idea, so thank you very much for making this possible. My background is in academia. I also do some work in terms of policy with an organization called RTA Exchange in Geneva, but predominantly I work in the private sector and I advise clients, companies on all aspects of customs. So this is valuation, classification, and origin as well. We can, I guess, all appreciate at this point that rules of origin are a complex and fairly technical topic. So I thought it would be best if I focus on three main questions or three main points that come up when we discuss origin. I will try to keep to 15 minutes. I also thought it was 20, so I make no promises in terms of being able to keep to 15 minutes. But if I skip over something, please ask me afterwards. So the three questions that come up most often when you discuss origin in the private sector are, the first one is, what type of rules of origin is the best? The second one is, how much of a challenge are rules of origin for the private sector? And then the final question is how we can build upon the current system of rules of origin and how can we change it and how we can modify it in the future. So the first question is, what is the best type of rules of origin? And that comes up quite a lot at the moment in the context of Brexit. I probably should add, I work in London, so Brexit is something that's quite close to what we do. And that's a difficult question because there's no clear answer from a private sector perspective. We talked a little bit about the fact that different countries have their own models of rules of origin. So US tends to sign FTAs with a similar type of rules of origin, EU with a similar type of rules of origin, and so on. However, recently there are some derogations to this principle. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one type is better than the other. Then we have the question whether value added or changing tariff classification criteria is better. And here again, there's no kind of one clear answer. Some regions, like in Asia, the value added component used to be much more popular. Some agreements, like the Australia-New Zealand one, have converted the majority of the rules of origin into the CTC criteria, so the change in tariff classification. And again, there's no kind of agreement as to which one is the best. From a private sector perspective, even if you look at particular industries, there's also no agreement. And we talked about the lobbying efforts from the private sector and companies. And I guess the key point here is that really depends. So even if you look at the car industry or chemical industry, in principle you can say auto industry prefers value added because it's easier. Chemical industry might prefer change in tariff classification because it's easier for them to demonstrate. But it's only a general principle. It really depends on the supply chain of a particular company, so it's really difficult to answer. And we talked about the fact who benefits from these rules of origin, as in they are designed to be a non-tariff barrier. They're designed to protect the domestic market. But if you make them too strict, then the utilization levels go down and the benefits, the economic benefits of a trade agreement are not realized. I'll move now to the second question, which is the how much of a challenge are rules of origin for the private sector, because I think this is probably the most interesting from your perspective. Rules of origin are very often quoted by companies as one of the key barriers when it comes to international trade. Now, I would argue that very often, even though they say rules of origin, it's not actually the rules of origin themselves. It's the origin regime or the wider origin regime. And what I'm referring to here is the administrative, bureaucratic burden and cost of complying with rules of origin and demonstrating origin, and the associated penalties and the associated risk with that. And the problem here is that if the cost of complying with rules of origin is too high compared to the margin of preference that a company can achieve by using a free trade agreement, in most cases they won't bother. They will just trade under MFN rates because there's no advantage. And the main issue for me is that the current preferential origin regime is not really adjusted to the global value chains, and I will be using the sexy term, the global value chains, as we said earlier. It's not adjusted to the fragmented production networks. It's not adjusted to complex operating models and fragmented production. There are a number of restrictions on both export and import side. On the export side, it's things like obtaining origin documentation, who can act as an exporter, obtaining the approved exporter status. And I know we're in the process of implementing REX, so things might change here a little bit. And then on the importing side, there's something else, and this is the consistency of documentation. In order to claim preference, you need to submit a number of documents, and this is a question of consistency of origin, shipping, and commercial documentation. And both sides, so both export and import, can pose problems to companies of different sizes. This is a problem for multinational companies, but it's also a problem for SMEs. I guess the two most common examples, or the two kind of things that could illustrate the point, would be the direct shipment and direct invoicing rules. Direct shipment is something that's present in majority, if not all, trade agreements, and it's basically a requirement for a product to be exported from country A to country B directly in order to gain preferential treatment. Now, in many cases, transshipment is possible under certain circumstances. Obviously, you have the requirement not to have any further processing, and you have the constant customs control. But the problem is, how do you evidence that? How do you demonstrate to South Korean customs authorities that the goods that were transshipped through Singapore and they spent some time in Singapore were kept under customs control? What kind of document do you provide? And the major problem is that it's left, it's subject to interpretation by the local customs authorities. And this is mainly a problem for SMEs, because given the volume of their exports, they very often cannot fill a container. So their goods are very often repackaged or stopped somewhere along the way. So that's one thing. The other one is direct invoicing. And that is mainly a problem for larger companies that have a complex operating model. And we're talking about a situation here when a good is exported from country A to country B directly, but based on the operating model, there's a number of financial transactions, a number of invoices that cover this movement. And in something like a toll manufacturing model, a principal model, where you have a number of sometimes related, sometimes non-related companies, you can have up to 3-4 invoices that cover this one export, this one movement of goods. And in such cases, there are often no provisions under an FTA that allow this third-party invoicing or this non-direct invoicing. So again, you have a situation when a good arrives in at its destination, and the customs authorities, local customs authorities, receive an invoice from a country that might not be might not be a member of the FTA. And how do they then decide whether this fits the origin requirements or not? And another thing is that these invoices very often contain confidential commercial information that you do not want your suppliers, for example, to see how much, what's the markup that you're applying. So sometimes it's not even feasible from a corporate perspective to provide all these invoices, because these are sensitive materials. So while the rules of origin are clearly defined in the text of an agreement, these kind of provisions are very often not defined. And the problem is that, as I mentioned, they are left to the local customs authorities and the customs authorities in the preference giving and the preference receiving country. And in my opinion, this is one of the main issues with the origin regime at the moment, because such practices create a third barrier to trade. So we have the first barrier, which is tariffs, which are obviously designed to be there. Then we have the second barriers, which are rules of origin themselves. And then we have this third barrier, which are the practicalities of operating under preference. Now, the problem here is that the first two barriers are deliberate. They have been negotiated, they are designed for a purpose, and they're supposed to be there. The third barrier serves absolutely no purpose. It's just an issue, an administrative problem, because it prevents companies who are eligible for preferential treatment from accessing the benefits of an FTA. So that, I think, is an issue. And it's very difficult for obvious reasons to find information on how much trade goes through this process, how much of a problem this is. But from our kind of private sector experience, this is an issue for a number of companies. And again, affecting both large companies as well as small companies. So with the changing of supply chains operating models, I feel that the preferential origin regime should really be adapted to that. And I know that the European Commission, European institutions have done a lot of work. There's the, on this topic, there's the consultations with the private sector when you're negotiating FTAs, like the EU-Mexico one. But there's still more efforts needed in this area. If you have clearer rules, you have better implementation, and you have more economic benefits. So it all comes down to providing the local customs authorities with more guidance. And this can be done either on a national level or within the FTA committees or on a multilateral level. But there's need for more guidance for customs authorities. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about the potential ways to think about rules of origin in the future. So this is not a full list. This is just one or two examples of how we can start thinking about rules of origin to expand their function and to maybe address certain issues that are not currently covered by rules of origin. And the first one here would be cumulation. And we discussed cumulation quite extensively this morning, so I won't go into too much details. But from a company's perspective, cumulation obviously allows for greater flexibility, which is good. Increased flexibility is always a positive outcome. And very often when we talk about mega regional agreements such as TTIP or TPP, expanded cumulation zone is one of the benefits. Obviously now we know that these large agreements are not doing so well at the moment, and we will see how many of them survive the next couple of years and what will happen with these large agreements. But there might be other ways to expand cumulation zones without signing large multinational agreements. Now, the traditional cumulation or traditional approach to cumulation has two main rules. One is that all countries need to be joined by an FTA, and then the other one is that these FTAs need to have identical rules of origin. And that can potentially have some drawbacks, because if you require all FTAs to have identical rules of origin, then you are preventing innovation in terms of new approaches to rules of origin. So you're basically you require parties to sign the same type of rules of origin, to commit to the same type of rules of origin over and over again. And that's not a good thing, because it doesn't allow you to test new approaches to rules of origin. So one way out of this is something that could be referred to as expanded cumulation or third-party cumulation. And it's not used to a great extent at the moment. We talked about some examples when it comes to graduating GSP countries to FTAs, and some examples of expanded cumulation for developing countries. But there are some examples out there in terms of actual FTAs, not for developing countries, but just bilateral FTAs, where that is applied on a sectoral basis and potentially in the future could be expanded. So one example here could be the Canada, Colombia, and I believe Chile as well, FTA, where they allow the use of auto parts from the US and nylon from US and Mexico as well as originating. So the way it works is that the goods need to be imported from US, so non-FTA parties such as US and Mexico, into the FTA territory. And they are treated as if the non-FTA parties were members of the FTA. So these goods are subject to the same rules of origin, even though these countries are not members and have not signed these rules of origin. But that's one of the ways to expand the accumulation zone without having this one model-fits-all rules of origin system applied across the board. So maybe that's something that could be used in the future or expanded or considered in the future, potentially in the context of Brexit, depending what happens there and whether the UK will decide on staying within the pan-Euromed zone or not. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention very quickly is modernizing or updating rules of origin based on new technologies and new products. This is something that's not an issue only for rules of origin, but it's also an issue for other areas of customs, so valuation and classification. And predominantly here we're talking about products with embedded services or new IT products. And in the policy area, this has been now referred to, or is being referred to as Mode 5 trade-in services. But this is something that we come across a lot in the private sector. So to give you an example, how do you, from a customs perspective, how do you treat a fitness tracker? Is it a pedometer? Is it something else? How do you treat it if it also measures your heart rate and it's connected to a heart monitor that you wear? Or if it is able to access your social media and you can read your emails? Or if it's connected to other devices that you either wear or not? This question of products that extend the traditional definition of what a product is has been around for a while. We had, a couple of years ago, we had this question with when action cameras came to the market. So is it a camera, is it a video camera, something like GoPro? That caused a lot of problems in terms of classification, and required a kind of a response. But going forward, the amount of goods that are interconnected, that have the services as one of the main components, will be increasing. And again, we'll need to address the valuation of such goods, but then rules of origin will need to follow and address this as well, because if you look at, for example, value added, how do you calculate value added of goods where a service component is such a high percentage of the value? And if the physical good is, the physical component is very small in terms of originating content, but the service component exceeds the physical part, is it an originating good? Is it not an originating good? So these are questions that will need to be addressed, and sooner rather than later, because we are receiving quite a lot of questions on that topic from the private sector. So just to summarize the 3 points, rules of origin really, the preference in terms of the private sector, in terms of rules of origin, really depends on your supply chain. It's very difficult to say what is best for a given industry, but the key issue is that rules of origin impact different parts of supply chains, different parts of economy and society, and therefore they need to be carefully analyzed before they're applied, because the impacts are significant. Second point is, and that is for me the most important part of this presentation, it's not necessarily the rules of origin themselves that are posing problems, but it's the way they are applied in practice and the way that companies need to comply with them from a purely practical perspective. And that is posing a lot of problems. And the third one is there's sufficient scope to expand on how the rules of origin are used at the moment without having this one-size-fits-all requirement, and to make them more inclusive and more flexible in the future. And I will stop here. Please ask me if I went over something too quickly. Please don't hesitate to ask questions.
Thanks a lot.